Events over the past year have gone a long way to focus attention on the country's racial divide. One response here in Massachusetts is a series of virtual forums presented by GBH and the Boston Globe called The State of Race. The goal is to examine race and inequality in connection with COVID-19, education, police reform, and the housing gap. To tell us about the series is the executive producer with GBH, also executive director of its studio at the Coffee Square Library, Linda Polach, and from one of the partners in the series, the president of the Boston branch of the NAACP, Tanisha Sullivan. I'd like to thank you both very much for being with us.
Thanks, Chris.
Our pleasure.
I want to start with Tanisha Sullivan because before the presenters got involved, you came to them with the idea for this. So explain, what made that happen?
Yeah, so we very early on, probably back in the fall of 2019, started engaging with several leaders within media here in the greater Boston area, including John Abbott and Brian McGorry. John Abbott from GBH, Brian McGorry from the Globe, really in anticipation of the National NAACP convention coming to Boston, really trying to talk about what role media can play in helping to address systemic racism. And so we had been engaged in a number of conversations for several months leading up to, of course, the announcement that the national convention was going to be virtual because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I approached both John and Brian and asked them if they'd be interested and willing to perhaps take on a project that would really open up the conversation about the state of race in Massachusetts and open it up in such a way that it would allow for the continuation, the ongoing engagement of conversation around race and learning around race for everyone in our Commonwealth. Of course, with the goal being to raise our collective awareness so that it leads to collective action to dismantling systemic racism.
One important definition, because people readily associate racism with individual behavior or attitudes. You're talking about systemic. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so we're talking about the structures, the systems, the policies, the practices that sometimes go unnoticed to many of us because we're just living our lives, but they are deeply rooted into the fabric of our society. So when we think about issues, and we'll talk a little bit about some of our series, we started with talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. So when we think about the disparate impact of the pandemic on Black and Brown communities, no one said, I always say, the virus doesn't discriminate, right? It doesn't say we're just going to attack Black people, Brown people, or low income people. But because of years of healthcare disparities that have built up, because of, access to jobs that allow people to make a living wage, those who are Black, Brown, and low income suffered oftentimes more deadly consequences of the virus than others. That starts to get to systemic racism, what's embedded in our systems that might not be overt to the naked eye.
Linda, GBH and the Globe are no strangers to these topics, but at the same time, to make this series happen, you had to pivot. So how did that work exactly?
Well, I think we started out with the notion that we wanted to do something. And then after several conversations, we talked about the topics that were going to come up at the NAACP convention, topics that we all recognize are really important when it comes to talking about race. And then we said, what can we do on those topics? We originally even kicked around the idea of doing 5 shows, one every night, which now when I think about it, I'm like, oh my God, thank God we didn't try to do that. We decided to do these forums, which are challenging because they're all virtual. So instead of being in a large auditorium with a lot of people you can look in the eye, we're doing this all by Zoom and interviews remotely. So it was a huge challenge. But we chose the topics, and it was actually, I think, Brian who suggested COVID-19 as the first one, which was brilliant because we're always trying to time these to events that are happening, the news, tapping into the feelings and the emotions and the news that is going on at the time. So the first one was about the disproportionate effect of COVID on Black people. And my job, I felt, was to bring in the history and information and tell that through the eyes of real people. So I feel that talking about policy can be really difficult unless you show people that these historic policies, systemic racism and systems impact real people. So in that show, we talked to Tito Jackson, who had experienced COVID and on a very personal and relatable level talked about what that meant for him and his family. And we talked to a state representative, Liz Miranda, who talked about her whole family, including her mother her grandmother had died as a result of COVID. And yet she felt she was a well-educated person, a person involved in the legislature, which again showed that COVID just, could hit anybody, but was getting to people in certain communities in a much greater way. So we've tried to take that model and replicate it for every show, whether it was COVID or police reform or education. We talk to real people, we get experts. So we have a panel of 3 people, including, and an additional, our host is Dan Lothian, who's an award-winning journalist, used to be the White House correspondent for CNN. I try to find somebody on a national level who can speak to the larger issues affecting the entire country. But then we find a community activist, somebody who's very involved in whatever the topic is in the Boston area. And then we involve a reporter from the Boston Globe whose expertise is that topic. And I should mention that, part of what we do is involve the community as well. It's a very large audience that we have virtually, but we do ask people for their questions. So that's probably been one of the most interesting things I found in these forums, is that people are really engaged and they want to know. There's a thirst for knowledge about the racial reckoning in this country. And to me, that's very positive. If people want information, they want to grow in this area themselves personally and collectively as a community. So it's a lot of moving parts, but it's been very successful.
Tanisha Sullivan, I did catch the part of the series on education, and there was one person in particular who I was really struck with. He came out of the Boston school system.
Yeah.
He could talk about racial barriers from a personal perspective, but also from a wider perspective. Yeah. And to me, that seems the kind of thing that I might know that story, but a lot of people don't know it. So why is it so important to get that out there?
Oh, it's absolutely important. I mean, it is the human aspect of this conversation, this big thing that we call racism. It's to Linda's point, it really does put a fine point on, the impact that racism has, whether it's overt racism or it's the systemic racism that so many of us not even asking, not even sometimes knowing are the victims of. Jamal Grant is the young man you're referring to. I met Jamal several years ago. He had just graduated from the John D. O'Brien in Boston, one of our top exam schools, and was a student at UMass Lowell. And, I was the chief equity officer in BPS, and he and I struck up a relationship, just talking about his experiences in BPS, being a phenomenal student. And yet realizing when he got to UMass Lowell, the deep disparities that existed even in his high quality education. Jamal has gone on to both Harvard and MIT. He's brilliant. And one of the things, to Linda's point, that we try to do from an NAACP standpoint is make sure when we are working with Linda and the team to identify folks to sit on the panel, people from the community, whether they're activists or advocates from the community, is to identify people who are not only policy practitioners, if you will, but also folks who they themselves are deeply connected to the experience and impact of systemic racism. And Jamal definitely reflects that.
Linda, one more topic coming up in the series is housing. That sounds like a huge undertaking. So what can we look forward to?
Well, I think in our housing program, which by the way airs on Thursday night at 7:30, people can still sign up for that at WGBH. We're going to be talking about a little bit about the history. It might surprise people to know that, you know, history has taken us to this point where people of color have a more difficult time finding places to rent, the ability to pay for rent, are excluded from the housing market. This is not something that happened overnight. This goes way back in history. I mean, obviously starting with slavery, but then going up into the 1930s and the Fair Housing Act and redlining. It's going to be pretty illuminating, I think, how we got here. We'll also be talking about the current crisis in evictions. We'll be talking about, I think sometimes we try to tackle the hard questions too. Interestingly, a couple of questions that I've gotten from audience members indicate that they have trouble with the idea of integration and having integrated communities. They fear their own identity or the identity of their culture might be worn down by that. And we can't be afraid to talk about that a little bit too. The sort of NIMBY attitude, not in my backyard, you know, it's great for those people to live there, but I don't want those people in my neighborhood. So we're going to deal with all that. But again, we bring in the human. We have some really fantastic guests. And we talked to two women in particular who are caught up in this whole housing crisis. And you know, one was homeless for an entire year and talks about dragging her 3 children from place to place and finally realizing when she finally got placed into permanent housing, how that was for her the connection to everything in life. It was, you know, we take it for granted. Housing is everything. If you don't have a safe place to put your head at night, the other things aren't going to come to you either. Education, financial success, professional career development. So we deal with personal stories on this too, so that we can illustrate that, again, we're talking about our brothers and sisters are human beings. And then we'll try to end the show, as we always do, with what can people do? Because a large number of the questions we get from our audience are, what can I do? I live in Newton, I live in Duxbury, I live in JP. I want to know as an individual, what can I do to help? And so we'll try to leave people with some ideas about what, you know, what their responsibility is and what they can do for their neighbors.
And that, Chris,
Tanisha,
for me,
yeah, please. Yeah,
I was going to say it's really important. It's an important part of this work. We are certainly the NAACP. We, you know, there are people who come to us all the time raising their hands to volunteer. But what we started to see, particularly last year, following the murder of George Floyd, was an uptick in outreach from across the Commonwealth. People from every corner of the Commonwealth wanting to learn more and wanting to do more. And so through this series and some of the other initiatives that we launched last year, you know, it really does respond to the thirst that people have. And I believe it's authentic to learn more, so that they can then figure out what their role is to play. You know, and also for people to understand that you don't have to look to Boston or Springfield or Lowell or New Bedford, right? The cities to make a difference. Difference can be made, you know, in Pittsfield, in Wellesley, you know, in Attleboro as well. There's work to do in all of our neighborhoods. And for people to be able to participate in these series, have their questions answered, perhaps even raise some more questions for folks that they can then go explore themselves. But ultimately to drive folks from across the Commonwealth to action within their own communities. That's truly one of the objectives for us as an organization, for the NAACP in this work.
And finally, Linda, just a little time here. If people want to catch up what's coming up later or revisit what you've already done, what's the best way to do that? And also about the time.
I just want to make the point also that we have taken the 3 digital series that we did last year and turned them around into television programs that are airing this week. Tonight at 7:30 on GBH, our half-hour show on police reform. And then today's Wednesday, right? Yeah, police reform is tonight. Tomorrow, the Housing Live Forum is at 7:30 p.m. People can sign up at wgbh.org in our events, or they can really watch it on Facebook or YouTube Live at 7:30. We like them to sign up so we know how many people we're reaching, but it's everywhere. And they can always go to our website to look at past shows, the digital shows from last year as well.
I'd like to thank you both very much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Rick.
Okay, that was Tanisha Sullivan from the Boston NAACP and Linda Polach from GBH. We'll have more news in just a moment.